New York City, early spring. The Hudson still carried a chill in the wind, and so did the hearts of those in command at Fort Delaney, an old but strategically vital U.S. Army base just outside the city. For decades, it had been ruled, some would say dominated, by Major General James K. Royston. Two stars gleamed on his shoulder, but it was the way people whispered his name that truly marked his power. Inside his corner office, Royston stood in front of a mirror, straightening his uniform. The creases were razor sharp, his silver hair was combed flat, his boots polished to a mirror sheen. Outside, his adjutant waited, files in hand and sweat on his brow. "Final schedule for tomorrow's change of command, sir," the young captain said, offering the file. Royston didn't look. His attention was on his reflection. "They're really putting a woman in charge," he muttered, more to the mirror than the man. "Yes, sir, Lieutenant General Rebecca Hale. Just arrived from Pentagon HQ." "A woman," Royston scoffed. "They think stuffing the brass with quotas is modernization. Well, we'll see how long she lasts." He turned, took the folder, and tossed it on the desk. For 2 months since the last commander's retirement, Royston had run Fort Delaney as though it were his own kingdom. He rerouted military funds, diverted construction materials to his upstate lodge, and kept anyone who questioned him buried in paperwork or reassigned. To many in the chain of command, he was untouchable. Until tomorrow. The parade field had been meticulously prepared. Soldiers were rehearsing under the guidance of Royston's hand-picked officers. Everything would run exactly as he wanted it, intimidating, precise, overwhelming, just as he planned. But when he arrived for the final rehearsal, something wasn't right. There in the commanding general's chair, meant to be empty for rehearsal, a lone soldier sat, calmly, drinking a cup of tea. Royston's boots echoed on the concrete as he approached. Officers stopped moving. Salutes stiffened. His glare cut across the courtyard. "Hey," he barked. "You! Who gave you permission to sit there?" The soldier turned, a woman, late 40s, composed, wearing a standard combat uniform, no formal insignia on display. Royston didn't wait. "Get your ass up, soldier. That seat belongs to the commanding officer, not some random coffee-sipping civilian playing soldier. Move!" A murmur rippled through the ranks. Everyone recognized the woman now. She stood slowly without flinching. Her voice was clear, low, unwavering. "Major General Royston," she said, "I appreciate your concern, but you may want to consult the new chain of command." Royston stepped closer, his voice rising. "Who the hell do you think you're talking to?" "Lieutenant General Rebecca Hale," she said, "Commanding General, Fort Delaney, as of 800 this morning." Silence, complete and crushing. Royston froze. The stars on her shoulders, 3, were now clearly visible as she stepped forward into the light. Her tea was gone. Her presence filled the courtyard. "I've reviewed the financial audits," she said, "the rerouted contracts, the personnel files, and I've heard the recordings." His voice cracked. "This is a misunderstanding. You insulted your superior officer in front of witnesses. You embezzled government resources. You disgraced this uniform." "Wait," she turned to the MPs. "Escort Major General Royston to holding, effective immediately, pending formal charges." The courtyard remained dead quiet as the soldiers took him by the arms. "I am not done," he shouted. "Oh, you are," Hale said, "and I'm just getting started." The wind off the Hudson felt colder than usual that morning, as word spread across Fort Delaney like wildfire. Royston had been arrested. Not quietly, not behind closed doors. Publicly. On the parade field. Before the full command. Staff meetings that were once filled with intimidation and silence were now filled with a different energy, uncertainty, whispers, and side glances. Lieutenant General Rebecca Hale had stepped into command without warning, without theatrics, and without tolerance for anything less than integrity. In her new office, formerly Royston's, she sat not behind the massive oak desk he had once demanded be brought in from Italy, but at the small metal operations table in the corner. The first thing she did after arriving that morning was strip the room bare. Medals, private Scotch stash, framed hunting photos, all removed. "Transparency starts here," she told her aide. "This isn't a museum, it's a command post. The aide nodded, clearly still reeling from the previous day's spectacle. Hale spent the morning reviewing files, some hastily hidden, others blatantly marked as confidential, but lacking any official security clearance. She saw invoices for concrete poured at a location that didn't match any known facility, mileage logs that didn't add up, and staff evaluations with suspicious gaps. Then there were the personal files. Women reassigned, promotions blocked, a culture of fear hidden under layers of formality. By noon, she had called in the senior staff. They entered the briefing room like men approaching a funeral. One by one, officers in starched uniforms sat down, eyes cautious. "You all know why you're here," Hale began, her tone direct but calm. "We can't move forward until we deal with what's behind us." She let the words hang in the air. What Royston did was not isolated. It was protected, enabled, ignored. That stops now. No one spoke. "I'm giving every one of you until 0700 tomorrow to submit a personal statement. Anything you've seen, anything you've done, any corners you've cut. I don't care if it was 5 days ago or 15 years ago. You come clean, or when the federal investigation starts next week, you'll go down with him." Colonel Peters, the oldest in the room, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, with respect, that seems excessive." She looked him dead in the eye. Not as excessive as winter boots that never arrived. Not as excessive as a mechanic who was passed over for promotion because she wouldn't attend a private dinner. Not as excessive as soldiers shivering in barracks while funds went to a hunting lodge in the Adirondacks. Peter swallowed his reply. "You want to serve? Prove it. Starting now." Later that evening, alone in her quarters, Hale sat with a mug of coffee and stared out at the base's perimeter lights. She didn't like ultimatums, but after what she'd seen in Royston's files, she knew kindness wouldn't dig this rot out. Fear was the only thing they had been trained to understand under his rule. She set her mug down and reached for a file labeled simply, "Whistleblower, Anonymous." Inside was a typed note from months earlier. "They think they can't be touched, but we're the ones paying the price. All I want is for someone to care again, for someone to listen." Hale closed the folder and exhaled. Tomorrow would be harder. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. Let's see how many find their conscience overnight. The morning air hung thick with tension. Inside the base headquarters at Fort Delaney, Lieutenant General Rebecca Hale sat alone at the operations table, a steaming mug beside her and a clock ticking too loudly on the wall. It was 6:59 a.m. Stacked neatly before her were sealed envelopes, 27 of them, some crisp, some smudged, one with a coffee ring on the corner. But what mattered wasn't how they looked, it was what they held. At exactly 0700, she opened the first. It was from a logistics officer. He admitted to signing off on shipments that never arrived, claiming he was threatened with reassignment if he refused. The second came from a major who had falsified training and reports under pressure from Royston. The third, an unsigned confession, revealed that unit inspections had been staged whenever higher command visited, and that non-compliance reports were shredded by order. By 0730, Hale had read through all of them. Some were cowardly, blaming others. Some begged for forgiveness. A few accepted responsibility without excuse. One, she noticed, was missing entirely. The base's head of procurement, Colonel Alan Byrd. She stood and called in her aide. "Find Colonel Byrd." Now. "Ma'am, he's not on base. His aide said he left early this morning." Hale's jaw tightened. "Where?" "They think he headed to West Point. Something about a family emergency. Alert military police and lock down the procurement office. Secure all files and systems. And contact OSI. This smells like a flight risk." The aide didn't hesitate. He sprinted out of the room. Hale picked up the envelope from her desk labeled, JAG, Immediate Review. She had already begun preparing for this. She'd known not all would come forward willingly. By 0900, base legal, military police, and internal auditors were in full swing. Computers were being imaged, hard drives copied, personnel questioned. Those who had confessed were called in individually. Some trembled. Some stood tall. Hale didn't raise her voice once. To each of them, she said, "You made mistakes, but this isn't about erasing the past. It's about choosing a future you can stand behind." By early afternoon, the base had changed. The sound of boots still echoed across the yard, but now it was accompanied by conversations that hadn't happened in years. Soldiers laughed without glancing over their shoulders. A junior lieutenant approached Hale in the dining hall and whispered, "Thank you, ma'am, for making it feel like an army post again." Outside, the sky had turned gray. In the distance, a Black Hawk helicopter appeared, unmarked, except for its Army tail number. Inside were two federal agents and a representative from the Department of Defense. They had come not just to review the files Hale had gathered, but to begin formal investigations. Hale met them on the tarmac. "Everything you need is ready," she said, handing over a sealed case file. "It's bigger than you think." One of the agents flipped open the case and nodded. "This is enough to put 3 senior officers under indictment." "Start with Royston," she said quietly. "But don't stop there." As the agents headed toward the base headquarters, Hale looked out across the field, toward the soldiers marching in formation. Clean lines, steady rhythm, something solid again. She allowed herself one quiet moment, and then her phone buzzed. "Ma'am," said the voice of her aide, "there's been a development. We've located Colonel Byrd." "Where?" "Trying to cross into Canada." Hale's lips pressed into a grim line. "Bring him back." Rain tapped lightly against the office windows as Lieutenant General Rebecca Hale reviewed the report. Colonel Alan Byrd, head of procurement, had been apprehended by U.S. border authorities just south of Montreal. He carried no orders, wore civilian clothes, and claimed he was on vacation. A duffel bag full of burner phones and $40,000 in cash told a different story. The MPs brought him back to Fort Delaney just after midnight. Hale waited. Now as dawn broke, Byrd sat across from her in a small windowless room. The air was stale with sweat and damp wool. He hadn't shaved. His uniform was wrinkled, his confidence gone. "You were trying to disappear," Hale said quietly. "Why?" He hesitated, then chuckled nervously. "Ma'am, I've served 30 years. I've got nothing to hide. I just needed a few days." "To flee to another country," she cut in, "with thousands in cash? With data files we recovered from your aide's office, encrypted and labeled Plan B?" Byrd's smile faltered. "You don't understand how things work at this level." "I understand more than you think," she replied. "Royston wasn't acting alone. You signed off on contracts for equipment that never arrived, training materials that were recycled junk, fuel lines that were siphoned off to private companies. I have the paper trail. You left it wide open." Byrd leaned back, defiant. "So what? You gonna court-martial everyone? Half this place would collapse if you pulled every thread." "Then let it collapse," she said, her voice suddenly hard, "and let something better grow from what's left." She stood. "You'll be held under Article 32 pretrial confinement. Legal counsel will be assigned, and just so you're clear, this isn't about optics. This is about justice." Byrd didn't respond. Outside the interrogation room, Hale's aide met her with a tablet. "Ma'am, there's a soldier who wants to speak to you. Private First Class Emilio Vega, Maintenance Battalion. Send him in." A few minutes later, a young man entered, nerves all over his face. Early 20s, uniform stiff, probably freshly ironed. "Private Vega," Hale nodded. "At ease." He hesitated. I don't know if I'm in trouble, ma'am. I was told to report falsified repairs for equipment that was never checked. If I said anything, my section chief warned I'd be blacklisted." "Did you falsify the reports?" "No, ma'am. I kept copies of the originals. I thought I might need them someday. I have them here." He held out a flash drive, his hand trembling. Hale took it carefully. "You're not in trouble, Private Vega. You did the right thing. And if anyone retaliates, they'll answer to me. Understood?" He nodded, eyes glistening. "Go back to your unit. I'll handle the rest." After he left, Hale sat down and plugged in the flash drive. The files were meticulous. Dozens of reports altered or suppressed, clearly tied to supply chain issues under Byrd's purview. Dates, signatures, names. She exhaled slowly. One more piece of the puzzle, and one more quiet hero. By noon, Hale had authorized a full audit of all equipment records going back 5 years. New investigators arrived from Washington. Old alliances began to fracture. Whispers turned to panic in the corridors. But through it all, Fort Delaney did not falter. The soldiers, Those who had endured the corruption, the silence, kept doing their jobs. Training, drills, daily formations. Because for the first time in years, someone was fighting for them. And the ones who had fed off the system, they began to realize that the ground beneath their boots was no longer safe. That afternoon, Hale sat on a bench outside the command center, looking across the parade ground. Spring was coming, and with it, reckoning. Fort Delaney had changed, not in the way a coat of paint changes a building, but in the way a wildfire changes a forest. Brutal, necessary, and final. The mess hall buzzed differently now. The jokes were looser, conversations more honest. Nobody glanced over their shoulder when speaking. But Lieutenant General Rebecca Hale knew that real change didn't live in optics. It lived in accountability. And there were still names to confront. That morning, she called in Colonel Ernest Mason, head of operations. He entered her office stiffly, as if his back hadn't bent since 1985. He saluted, held it too long. "At ease, Colonel. Sit." He did, but barely. "You've been with Fort Delaney how long?" she asked. 17 years, ma'am." "Long time to see how things were run." He blinked. "Yes, ma'am. I've read your file. You didn't steal money, didn't falsify documents, but you signed every quarterly report that covered for Royston. Every request he made, you initialed." "I followed the chain of command." "No," Hale said quietly. "You followed silence." Mason sat straight at her. "I served with honor. I kept this base running. You enabled a man who used soldiers like stepping stones, and you kept your head down while good people were broken." He clenched his jaw. "What would you have had me do?" She leaned forward. "Tell the truth. One memo, one call, one voice. That's all it would have taken to start unraveling this." Mason didn't reply. "I'm not here to destroy reputations. I'm here to rebuild integrity. But that starts with honesty." She opened a drawer and slid a form across the desk. "Voluntary early retirement, full honors, no public charges, but your time here is over." Mason stared at the paper. "You're giving me a way out. I'm giving you a choice. Stay and face an inquiry, or leave with what little dignity you have left." He stood trembling. "I'll sign it, then do it by 1700. Mason walked out, slower than when he'd entered. Hale watched him go, another thread pulled from a rotted cloth. Later that afternoon, as rain clouds thickened over the parade ground, Hale met with Sergeant Major Donna Rains. A combat veteran, Rains had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and a quiet rumor said she'd once stood up to Royston behind closed doors and paid for it. "I read the whistleblower letter," Hale said. "I believe it was yours." Rains didn't flinch. "I didn't sign it." "I know, but it's your voice." Rains exhaled. "I tried, ma'am. Back then, nobody listened. After a while, I stopped trying." "Well, I'm listening now. I have names, and I have a list of every junior soldier who was demoted, transferred, or pushed out because they questioned things." Hale leaned forward. "Then I want that list. Every single one." That night, while the base slept under steady rainfall, Hale stayed in her office, cross-referencing names. Private Vega's name was there. So were 15 others. She began writing orders. By morning, each of those soldiers would receive notice. Retroactive rank restoration. Clearance for new positions. Full review of disciplinary actions. It was only the beginning. But for the first time in years, justice at Fort Delaney had a paper trail. And Rebecca Hale was making damn sure it wouldn't be buried. The sun finally broke through the clouds the next morning. A rare golden light spread across the grounds of Fort Delaney, glinting off flagpoles and warming the faces of soldiers who had grown used to shadow. Lieutenant General Rebecca Hale stood at attention in the open field, watching as 15 soldiers formed a line before her. They ranged in age, background, and branch. Some had been quietly demoted. Others were reassigned to desk jobs or sent to dead-end postings. All had one thing in common. They'd stood up when it was dangerous to do so. Behind Hale stood Sergeant Major Donna Rains, holding a stack of folders. "This isn't ceremonial," Hale said, voice firm but warm. "This is correction." She stepped forward, handing each soldier a folder. Inside, a letter of apology, reissued orders, and full reinstatement of rank. "To Private First Class Emilio Vega," she added quietly, "welcome back." specialist. His eyes watered, but he stood tall. Once the final folder was handed out, Hale addressed the group. You were punished for doing the right thing. That stops today. If this army is going to mean something again, it starts with people like you. As the small group dispersed, Rain stepped forward. Didn't think I'd ever see a day like this, she said. You'll see more, Hale replied, if we build it right. By afternoon, the base was humming with energy. The old guard, still lingering like ghosts in the hallways, found themselves increasingly sidelined. Their power was fading. Some retired early, others tried to cozy up to the new order. Hale saw through it all. In her office, she reviewed the final audit report from the Department of Defense investigators. It was staggering. Royston's network had extended well beyond Fort Delaney into procurement offices, logistics units, and even civilian contractors across 3 states. Dozens of contracts were flagged. Millions of dollars siphoned through shell companies. The fallout wouldn't be contained to one base. A knock at the door. Come in. Major Harris, legal counsel, stepped in. Ma'am, the U.S. Attorney's Office is ready to move on federal charges. They're asking for a full statement from command. Give them everything, Hale said. No redactions. Yes, ma'am. As Harris turned to leave, Hale added, and have Rains join me in the old chapel at 1700. The chapel was unused. Dusty pews, faded flags, a forgotten place. At 5 sharp, Hale stood in the doorway, staring up at the wooden beams overhead. When Rains arrived, she paused beside her. Oh, why here? Because this is where they buried the truth, Hale said. Chaplain's reports were falsified, counseling logs erased. This place became a dumping ground for silent pain. They walked to the altar together. I want this turned into a resource center, counseling, ethics training, a place where rank doesn't matter, where soldiers speak and are heard. Rains nodded. We'll need volunteers. We'll have them. The ones who've lived it are the ones who'll lead it. Before they left, Hale knelt and picked up a long-forgotten nameplate from the floor. Chaplain Thomas A. Mercer. He filed the first formal complaint against Royston, disappeared 2 months later, transferred to Alaska, never heard from again. She looked at the nameplate. We owe him this. As they stepped out of the chapel into the fading sunlight, a gust of wind caught the chapel doors, slamming them shut behind them. The old ways were closing. The new ones had only just begun to open. The following week brought a stillness over Fort Delaney, not from complacency, but from attention. Everyone, cadets, clerks, senior officers, was watching, listening, waiting. The silence of fear had been replaced by the silence of readiness. Lieutenant General Rebecca Hale moved through the base with no escort. She didn't need one. Respect had grown not from fear, but from the simple fact that she kept her word. In the base hospital, she met with Captain Marissa Owens, a military physician who had quietly logged a dozen mental health complaints over the past year. Cases that mysteriously never made it to higher command. They always came to me last, Owens said. After trying their NCOs, their COs, the chaplain, most gave up. Some, she paused, some didn't make it. Hale sat with her in a quiet room off the ward. I want every suppressed file, every redacted name. I want to know who was silenced and who did the silencing. Owens nodded. There's a lot. Good. Start with the last year. Then we go back 5 more. As Hale left the hospital, her phone buzzed. Sergeant Major Rains. Ma'am, we've confirmed it. Chaplain Mercer filed a complaint against Royston and Bird 6 years ago. It was intercepted by then Colonel Mason. Never reached JAG. Hale stopped walking. Where's Mercer now? Assigned to an outpost near Fairbanks, Alaska. Administrative leave since 2021. Living alone. Reach out. I want to speak to him myself. That afternoon, Hale sent an official request for a full IG review of Fort Delaney's past command structure. The response came in faster than expected. The Inspector General's office would send a task force in 10 days. 10 days to clean the rest of the rot. 10 days to prepare for an army-wide reckoning. At sunset, Hale stood at the newly reopened chapel, now officially renamed the Mercer Center for Ethics and Resilience. A small bronze plaque bore the inscription, "In memory of those who spoke when others stayed silent." Inside, Private First Class Emilio Vega and Specialist Carla Nguyen led a group of 10 soldiers in a discussion circle. No uniforms, just stories. Some laughed, one cried, none looked away. Rain stepped up beside Hale. Did you ever think you'd see this? Not here, Hale said. But that's the thing about soil. It looks dead until something decides to grow. That night, Hale didn't return to her quarters. She walked the perimeter of the base alone, watching soldiers standing guard, drill instructors finishing final rounds, lights glowing softly in barracks windows. She paused at the parade field, where the wind rustled the flags. Royston had once stood there believing it was his domain. Now the land felt different, owned not by one man, but by all who served. She stood quietly for a moment, then said aloud to the wind, 10 more days. And the wind answered only with stillness. It was a Wednesday when the past knocked on Fort Delaney's door. Lieutenant General Hale stood in the comms room, watching the incoming call stabilize. Secure channel, direct line from Alaska. On the screen, a man appeared. Early 60s, heavy beard, eyes tired but sharp. Chaplain Thomas Mercer, she said. He nodded. Lieutenant General Hale wasn't expecting a call from Delaney ever again. I've reviewed your personnel file, and I've seen the complaint you submitted in 2017. It never made it past internal routing. I believe you were punished for it. Mercer let out a hollow laugh. I filed that report after counseling a young sergeant who'd been coerced by Royston into falsifying documents. 2 weeks later, I was on a plane to Fairbanks, no explanation. No return. You were the first voice, Hale said, and you were buried. I wasn't the last, Mercer replied, but I was the first to believe they'd do the right thing. I was wrong. You weren't, Hale said. You were early. There was silence between them for a moment. Two soldiers who knew what it cost to speak when no one wanted to listen. I'd like your permission to include your original complaint in the report to the IG team arriving next week, Hale said. Mercer leaned forward. Use everything. Just make it count. She nodded. After the call ended, Hale sat still for a long time. The clock ticked. Outside, the sound of drills carried across the open space. The Army moved forward. But justice required us to look back. She turned to her aide. I want a letter sent to Mercer, official apology, signed by me. Yes, ma'am. The rest of the day was consumed with preparation. The Mercer Center officially opened that morning, and Sergeant Major Rains had organized the first round of ethics workshops, starting with command staff. No one was exempt. Meanwhile, new faces had started arriving on base, a lieutenant colonel from Fort Bragg, a civilian auditor from D.C., a JAG attorney specializing in systemic misconduct cases. They weren't here to visit. By late afternoon, Hale received a message from Vega. Ma'am, someone left this in my locker. Attached was a photo of a folded note. No signature. Some things were never meant to see daylight. If you keep pushing, someone's going to get hurt. Let it go. Hale stared at the image, her jaw clenched. By nightfall, she called an emergency meeting with base security and Rains. This isn't a threat. It's desperation. Someone knows what's coming. Rains folded her arms. Want to lock it all down? No, Hale said. We move forward, twice as fast. She stood at the window as the last light faded from the sky. The truth is waking up, and that scares them. Let it. In the quiet that followed, Hale made a decision. Tomorrow she would hold an all-hands briefing. No more corridors, no more secrets. Everyone would hear the truth. Together. And Fort Delaney would have to choose who it really served. They packed the auditorium to the walls. Soldiers, officers, clerks, medics, MPs, every rank, every role, every corner of Fort Delaney stood shoulder to shoulder under the flickering lights. Some looked tired, some looked wary, and all were quiet. At 0900 sharp, Lieutenant General Rebecca Hale walked onto the stage. No podium, no insignia-heavy jacket, just her in a simple uniform, sleeves rolled up, boots still muddy from morning rounds. She didn't speak for several seconds, just looked at them. When I arrived here, she began, this base was quiet in all the wrong ways. People were working hard, but watching over their shoulders. Good soldiers kept their heads down. Bad ones kept climbing, she paused. You all know what happened with Major General Royston. You know the investigations are growing beyond Fort Delaney. I won't insult you by pretending that's surprising. A few shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded. What you may not know, she continued, is how many of you stood up when it wasn't safe to. Some quietly, some loudly, some with consequences that never should have happened. She looked across the room. Those who helped expose corruption are not traitors. They are soldiers. They upheld the values we're supposed to stand for. Integrity, courage, duty. She took a breath. I've read the files, the ones that were buried, the whistleblower reports, the counseling notes that were deleted, the reprimands that were fabricated, the punishment of honesty. Then her tone shifted, harder, colder. And I've read the threats. I've seen the unsigned notes left in lockers. I've heard the whispers warning people to stay quiet. A few faces went pale. That ends now. She walked slowly across the front of the stage. If you're still here, still trying to cover for what came before, I have two pieces of advice. Pack your things and pray. Because the Inspector General's team arrives in 5 days, and when they leave, this base will not be the same. Hale stopped at center stage. But if you're here to serve, not a man, not a legacy, but the oath, you're not alone anymore. She raised her voice, not shouting, but enough to fill the room. Fort Delaney is not a kingdom. It's a post, a responsibility, and every person in this room has a role in rebuilding it. Silence again, heavy, absolute. Then a single voice broke through from the back. Hooah! Followed by another. Then a wave, until the entire room erupted in a rolling chorus of hooah! Hale didn't smile, but her eyes shone. After the briefing, dozens stayed behind to speak. Some came forward with new files. Others shared names. A few just said thank you. That night, as the base settled into a rare, steady quiet, Sergeant Major Raines found Hale sitting outside the Mercer Center. You made them believe again, Raines said. No, Hale replied. They remembered on their own. I just gave them permission. She looked up at the stars, cold and distant. And now we finish what we started. Friday came with a thunderstorm. Heavy clouds rolled over Fort Delaney like armor plating across the sky. Rain hammered the rooftops, soaked the fields, and drummed against the windows of the command building. But inside, the storm had already begun. Lieutenant General Rebecca Hale stood in the Mercer Center conference room with the Inspector General's advance team, 6 men and women in Army and civilian attire, all hardened by years of rooting out what others tried to hide. Welcome to Delaney, she said, sliding a stack of files across the table. That's your starting point. The lead investigator, Colonel Lynn Morales, opened the top folder. This is more than we expected. Hale nodded. There's more. Interviews have been scheduled. Whistleblower protections in place. The ones who came forward, some are scared, but they're ready. Morales flipped through the documents. And those who didn't come forward? They're starting to pack. Outside MPs were already moving through offices, securing access points, logging personnel entries. Internal servers were cloned, physical files boxed and tagged. Hale had ordered full transparency. No resistance. By noon, the power balance on base had shifted visibly. Officers who once barked orders were silent. Soldiers who once hesitated now spoke freely. At 1400, Sergeant Major Raines brought in a sealed envelope. Found this in a lock-in drawer in the old finance office, marked Personal JKR. Hale opened it. Inside were hand-signed letters from Royston to several civilian contractors. Promises of continued discretionary bonuses and informal reimbursements in exchange for loyalty and silence. Some went back a decade. She stared at the signature. James K. Royston. Below the letters, a note in different handwriting. They always said he was untouchable. I kept the proof anyway. If you're reading this, maybe he finally wasn't. No name. Hale passed the folder to Morales. Add it to the chain. We'll need subpoenas. At 1700, the rain broke. The clouds began to pull back, revealing a pale stripe of sky over the Hudson. Hale stood by the flagpole, watching the wind snap the stars and stripes overhead. She could feel the shift in the air, not just weather, but momentum. Behind her, Private Emilio Vega approached, still in his work uniform. Ma'am, she turned. Specialist Vega. I just wanted to say, if this place turns around, it's because of you. She shook her head. No, it's because someone like you kept the receipts. He grinned. Still feels like a new army. Maybe it is. That evening in her office, Hale recorded a video briefing for Army Command. This investigation will shake more than Delaney. Contracts, personnel, records, it's systemic. But there are soldiers here still doing it right, still worth fighting for. She ended with one final line. We can't control the storm, but we can choose who we are when it hits. As she hit send, lightning split the sky outside. The storm wasn't over, but the foundations were finally holding. By Monday, the calm had turned into precision. The IG team split into two, one focused on contracts and finances, the other on personnel files and disciplinary records. Lieutenant General Hale oversaw it all, moving between rooms like a commander during wartime, not barking orders, but asking sharp questions, reading every face. What had once been whispers were now statements under oath. Sergeant Major Rains entered her office midday with an update. 3 more officers just requested early retirement. One tried to resign without facing the board. Hale didn't look up. Deny it. No one walks away without facing what they did. Understood. Rains lingered. There's something else. Hale met her eyes. One of the whistleblowers, Corporal Rivera, she's missing. Hale stood. Explain. She failed to report for duty this morning. Her room's empty. No sign of forced entry. Her locker was cleared out. MPs? Already checking cameras and gate logs. Last sighting was yesterday afternoon near the motor pool. Hale's jaw clenched. She's the one who flagged the false medical discharges. Yes, ma'am, she named names. Then someone got nervous. An hour later, the base security chief entered Hale's office with grim news. Rivera's ID had been scanned at the west gate, but she hadn't signed any leave form. A civilian vehicle had picked her up, registered to a company under one of the flag contractors' names. Hale's voice went cold. Abduction? Too early to say, but it doesn't look voluntary. Put out a bolo, notify Army CID, I want federal involvement. By evening, the search had widened to nearby counties. Local authorities joined the effort. Rivera's photo was circulated. The media hadn't picked up the story yet, but it was a matter of time. At 2200, Hale called a closed-door meeting with Morales and the lead CID investigator. We've been treating this as a command issue, she said, but it's bigger. There are civilians involved, contracts with kickbacks, missing soldiers. If we don't take this outside Delaney now, we'll lose control of it. Morales nodded. We've already contacted DOJ. They're interested. I want a federal task force set up within 72 hours. Done. After they left, Hale sat alone in her office, staring at Rivera's personnel photo. A young woman, mechanic, Texas native, sharp, brave, and now gone. She whispered, I will find you. Then she opened a new file on her desk. Subject, civilian contractor, oversight, phase 2. Her pen scratched across the paper with purpose. It was no longer just about Fort Delaney. It was about everyone who thought they could touch a soldier and disappear. As Rain returned to tap at the window, Hale wrote a new directive. Begin contractor audit across all bases receiving shared procurement funding since FY18. Request full support from Pentagon legal and civilian oversight boards. Time to flip the entire system. Somewhere out there, Rivera was waiting, and Hale didn't leave people behind. The morning brief at Fort Delaney felt different. Faces were tighter, voices quieter, urgency thicker. Word of Corporal Rivera's disappearance had spread, though unofficially. Soldiers asked questions they weren't allowed to answer. Rumors moved faster than orders. Lieutenant General Rebecca Hale stood at the center of it all, eyes scanning every report, every thread. At Aero 700, her aide entered, breathless. Ma'am, we've got something. Local police near Shroon Lake responded to a call about a suspicious vehicle in a barn. Unregistered. Inside, they found a woman. Alive. Hale didn't flinch. Rivera? Yes, ma'am. She's been taken to a hospital. Shaken, bruised, but conscious. Any idea who took her? The property is owned by a shell company linked to Byron Steel. Hale froze. Byron Steel. Civilian contractor, former defense acquisition consultant, longtime ally of Royston. His name had surfaced in the files, but never with enough proof until now. Send a team to interview Rivera quietly, No press, no leaks. By 1000, Hale was in a secure hospital room 2 hours north of the base. Rivera sat upright in bed, one arm bandaged, her eyes fierce despite the trauma. "I didn't think anyone would come," she whispered. "We don't leave our people behind," Hale said. Rivera nodded. "They were scared about what I said, about what I had. There's more." On my tablet, she handed Hale a mud-streaked device pulled from a canvas bag. "Everything's on here, the fake orders, the contractor payouts, the names." Hale took it, her grip firm. "We'll finish this," she promised. That evening back at Fort Delaney, the data was decrypted. It was worse than expected. Over 12 million in fake repairs. Civilian companies billing the Army for parts never delivered. Repairs never made. Soldiers pushed out on false discharges to make room for contractor-trained personnel. Dozens of signatures, multiple bases, and Byron Steele's name was on nearly every deal. By midnight, the Department of Justice had a task force in motion. Warrants were prepared, bank accounts frozen, indictments drafted. Hale stood alone in her office, staring at the map on her wall. Pins marked every base linked to the scheme. "What Royston started," she said quietly, "was never just about one man. It was a network, a shadow army within the army." She turned to Raines, who stood in the doorway. "How long until the press finds out?" "Hours, maybe. Once Steele's arrested, it'll break. Then we stay ahead of it." She stepped to her desk, turned on the camera, and recorded her first public statement. "To every soldier who's ever been told to shut up and fall in line, to every NCO who saw something wrong and was silenced, we hear you now, and this time we act." She looked straight into the lens. Fort Delaney isn't falling, it's rising, and the rest of the system is about to follow. The headlines hit by sunrise. Military contractor arrested in Army fraud scandal. Whistleblower rescued Defense Department at rocked by massive corruption ring. Fort Delaney, commander leads investigation into deep systemic abuse. By 0900, the media vans were camped outside Fort Delaney's gates. Reporters shouted through fences, cameras pointed like rifles, and helicopters circled overhead. Inside, Lieutenant General Rebecca Hale moved like the eye of a hurricane. She stepped into the press room, not with spin, but with evidence. "In the last 10 days, my command has uncovered millions in fraudulent contracts, falsified discharges, and coordinated intimidation of active duty soldiers. What began as internal misconduct has expanded into a federal investigation that now spans 5 Army installations and at least 3 civilian defense firms." She paused. "This is not an embarrassment. This is an awakening, and we will not run from it." A reporter stood. "General Hale, do you think Fort Delaney can recover its reputation after this?" Hale's voice stayed calm. "Fort Delaney is not a name on a sign. It's the people who serve here, the mechanics who work double shifts, the medics who treat without question, the privates who stood up when generals stayed silent. Their reputation isn't broken. It's being restored." As cameras flashed, she walked out. No applause, no spectacle, just clarity. In the command center, Raines was waiting. "They've arrested Steele in New Jersey. He had multiple passports, encrypted phones, and $500,000 in cash." "Good," Hale said. "That's one head of the snake." "There's more," Raines added. "Rivera's tablet also shows payments routed through a legal firm that worked on Royston's private land acquisition. Properties in North Carolina, Virginia, and one undeclared site in Montana." Hale sighed. He was building his retirement on government theft. He almost got away with it, but he didn't. That night, Fort Delaney held its first open grounds assembly in over 2 years. No dress blues, no rank required. Soldiers, spouses, children, even retired veterans from town, gathered in the field under lantern light. At 2000, Hale stood before them. "No more shadows," she said. "No more secrets. If this institution is going to survive the century ahead, it won't be because we hid from what we've done. It'll be because we faced it together." She looked across the crowd. "To the ones who spoke up, thank you. To the ones who stayed silent but changed course, there's still time. And to anyone still clinging to the old ways, know this: your time is over." In the crowd, Vega stood beside Rivera, her arms still in a sling. Beside them, Raines folded her arms, watching her commander with the quiet pride of a soldier who had waited too long for the right leader. And somewhere behind the light, In the watching dark, the past knew it had lost its grip. Fort Delaney had stepped into the future, and it wasn't looking back. The investigations didn't slow, they accelerated. By the end of the week, 3 more contractors had been arrested. 6 officers across different installations were placed under suspension. 2 retired generals were subpoenaed. Lieutenant General Rebecca Hale sat in her office at Fort Delaney, a thick case file open on her desk, a fresh cup of black coffee cooling beside her. Across from her, Colonel Lynn Morales from the Inspector General's office debriefed. We've confirmed the Montana property was purchased using shell accounts tied to Royston's family trust. It was meant to be a private retreat, built with Army materials, labor disguised as joint training exercises. Hale shook her head. He turned soldiers into unpaid contractors. It gets worse. That land sits atop federal conservation territory, illegal development, environmental crimes. DOJ is coordinating with Interior. Hale's eyes narrowed. He wasn't just corrupt. He was arrogant. Morales nodded. He believed no one would ever check. At noon, Hale gathered her senior staff, not just commanders, but also logistics, medical, chaplains, legal, junior NCOs. She stood at the center of the operations floor. We've come far, she said, but we're not done. She tapped the whiteboard behind her. At the bottom, Phase 3, rebuilding. From this point on, and we shift our mission. The ROT is being removed. Now we build what should have been here all along. The plan was simple but radical. Establish independent ethics liaisons in each department. Monthly anonymous soldier feedback reports reviewed at command level. Quarterly base-wide audits, not led by internal staff, but by rotating oversight teams. New mentorship programs between junior enlisted and senior leadership. Direct whistleblower hotlines linked to external oversight. Someone asked, "Ma'am, will the Army approve all this?" Hale didn't blink. "I'm not waiting for approval. I'm acting within command authority until someone tells me not to. And if they try, they'll have to explain why." Outside the window, the flag flapped hard in the March wind. A storm had passed. The air was raw, but clearing. That evening, Hale walked the perimeter with Rains. "You think they'll try to put it back the way it was?" Rains asked. "They might," Hale replied, "but we'll leave too many fingerprints for them to pretend it never happened." She stopped at the edge of the training field. "When I first took command, I thought I'd be tearing down a man. But Royston was never the whole problem. He was just the part that smiled in the mirror." "And now?" Rains asked. "Now I see what we're really doing. We're rebuilding a contract between the Army and its people, between the oath and the soul." Silence settled between them. "You ever get tired?" Rains asked. "All the time." "Then why keep pushing?" Hale looked out over the field where floodlights glowed and young soldiers moved in tight formation. "Because they deserve better than what we inherited. And I refuse to leave it broken." The two stood together, boots in the damp grass, watching as Fort Delaney took its next steps. This wasn't a comeback. This was a reinvention. It was 0400 when the call came. Lieutenant General Rebecca Hale was already awake. She didn't sleep much anymore, not since the Rivera abduction, not since the dominoes started to fall. Her aide's voice came through the line, breathless. "Ma'am, Royston has turned himself in." Hale didn't speak. He walked into a federal courthouse in D.C. at 0326, alone, with a lawyer, no press, no resistance. She sat at the edge of her bunk, the cold pressing into her bare forearms. "Charges?" she asked. 26 federal counts. Fraud, conspiracy, misuse of military resources, obstruction, 2 sealed indictments. Bail denied. "And what does he want?" The aide hesitated. "He asked for you." By 0700, she was airborne, her transport slicing through the clouds above Pennsylvania. Rain washed the windows. Inside, Hale reviewed a folder, Royston's complete timeline, every infraction, every name. She didn't need it. She knew it all by heart. By 0900, she sat in a secured federal interview room. Across from her sat Major General Return James K. Royston, hands folded, eyes sunken, hair thinner. He looked like an echo of the man who had once commanded Fort Delaney with fear and fire. "I figured it'd be you," he said. "I didn't come for closure," Hale replied. "You came for the why." "No," she said. "I came to tell you this. None of this ends with you." He stared at her. "Then why am I here?" "Because you finally realized what it costs to build a kingdom on silence." Royston smirked. I didn't think anyone would ever follow the trail. They did, and they followed it to you, and past you. He exhaled. Do what you want. I'm tired. Maybe I always was. Hale stood. It's not about what I want. It's about what comes next. She turned to leave. Was I the worst? Royston asked. She stopped. You weren't the worst, she said. You were just the one who got caught first. That afternoon, back at Fort Delaney, the mood was strangely quiet, not heavy, measured. Soldiers walked with a little more purpose. Staff meetings began on time. There were no more locked doors. In the Mercer Center, Rivera returned to her duties, now serving as liaison for ethical compliance. She wore no special rank, but when she entered a room, people listened. At sunset, Hale walked alone to the parade field. She stopped at the far edge, where the grass met the stone wall, and the names of those who had served were carved deep. She laid her hand on the newest engraving. CPLT Rivera, witness, survivor, soldier. A voice behind her. You think it'll stick this time? It was Rains. Hale didn't turn. I don't know, she said, but we've done more than just expose the rot. We've planted something, and whatever it is, it's stronger than fear. The sky turned purple, then navy. Let's make sure it grows, Hale whispered. And together they stood, not as generals and sergeants, but as guardians of a different kind of legacy, not of rank, not of reputation, but of responsibility. Spring settled over Fort Delaney like a quiet oath, spoken not in words but in changed behavior. Inspections were no longer performances. Counseling sessions were attended, not avoided. Promotions were earned, not arranged. Lieutenant General Rebecca Hale kept a lower profile now. She didn't need to command from a podium. Her influence had seeped into the rhythms of the base, into the way soldiers greeted each other, into the fact that no one hesitated to knock on her door. But change, she knew, needed roots, and so she focused on permanence. In the base library, a new section was added, the Accountability Archive. It included redacted reports from the investigation, transcripts from command hearings, and personal testimonials. Rivera's among them. It wasn't about shame, it was about truth. The plaque above it read, "A lesson ignored is a mistake repeated." One afternoon, she walked the grounds with a young officer, Second Lieutenant Talia Monroe, top of her class, new to Fort Delaney. You've read the reports? Hale asked. Monroe nodded. Every page. Good. Then you understand the difference between authority and leadership. Monroe hesitated. One commands with rank, the other earns with action. Hale smiled faintly. Close. One survives by fear, the other survives by trust. They stopped at the newly refurbished barracks, where the heating worked and the walls no longer leaked. Soldiers had painted murals inside. Flags, mountain scenes, quotes from their own unit. At the center of one mural, a single pair of boots in the snow. Underneath it, in hand-painted stencil, he walked it first. It was Richter, the fallen general, the one who had once been the problem and in the end had become something else. Monroe looked at it. Was it true, ma'am, that he saved a soldier with his own body heat? Hale looked at the boots. Yes, and then he saved this place with something more rare. What's that? Humility. That night, a package arrived in Hale's office. No sender listed. Inside, a small wooden box. Old, worn, etched with a name. Royston. She opened it. Inside was a single object, his command coin. On the back, scratched in jagged letters, you were right. No note, no return address. Unbo. No return. Just a token from a man who once believed he couldn't fall, and had completely. Hale placed it on a shelf beneath a framed photo of the original Mercer Chapel. She said nothing, but for a moment her hands trembled. In the days that followed, she worked quietly on a new directive. It wasn't dramatic, it wouldn't make headlines, but it mattered. Every graduating officer from Fort Delaney would now spend their first 6 weeks shadowing enlisted soldiers. No command, no authority, just listening. Because if leadership was to mean anything again, it had to be built from the bottom up. And Hale, more than anyone, had learned what happened when power started at the top and looked only downward. Not again, not on her watch. The heat of early summer arrived quietly at Fort Delaney, melting away the last of the frost that had lingered in corners no one had noticed before. Trees bloomed, The field grass grew thick, and for the first time in years, laughter didn't sound suspicious. Lieutenant General Rebecca Hale sat alone on the steps of the Mercer Center. It was Sunday. The chapel was quiet. A dozen soldiers had just left a peer-led resilience group that now met every week without command supervision. It was working because it wasn't hers. She watched as Private Rivera walked across the yard with a clipboard tucked under her arm. Two other soldiers caught up to her. They laughed. She didn't flinch, didn't look over her shoulder. Hale smiled. Behind her, Sergeant Major Raines approached with 2 mugs of coffee. "Thought I'd find you here." "You always do." They sat in silence, listening to the wind rattle the flag high above the yard. "We got the report back from DOJ," Raines said. "Steele pled guilty. So did 2 of the contractor execs. Royston's final sentencing is next month." Hale nodded. "Good, Omekben. Let it end where it should." Raines hesitated. "And the Army?" she asked. "Command says you've been recommended for reassignment. DC wants you on the reform task force." Hale looked out over the field. "They always want to bring it back to the center, but the real work's done at the edge." "You going to take it?" Hale didn't answer right away. "I'm thinking about it, but not because it's a promotion. If I go, it's to make sure what we did here isn't erased by paperwork and policy." Raines raised an eyebrow. "And if they try?" Hale smirked. "And I'll remind them what happens when you ignore a soldier with a voice." That evening, as golden light washed the base, a quiet ceremony unfolded behind the Mercer Center. No podiums, no rank, just 30 soldiers standing in a circle. In the center, a small stone was laid into the ground, engraved simply, "To those who stood up when standing was dangerous." Hale said nothing. She placed a folded slip of paper beneath the stone before it was sealed. The words were hers. "Power means nothing if it forgets who it serves." Afterwards, soldiers lingered. Some talked, some cried, some just stood, eyes on the horizon. Rivera found Hale as she was leaving. "Ma'am," she said, "I heard about DC." "Nothing's decided yet." Rivera smiled. "Whatever you choose, we're ready here. You built this base on trust. We'll hold the line." Hale felt the weight of those words, not as pressure, but as promise. And as darkness settled over Fort Delaney, she realized something simple and unshakable. She could leave, because now someone would stay. July brought heat waves and headlines. Across the country, reforms moved faster than expected. What began at Fort Delaney had spread. Audits launched at 7 other installations, contractors blacklisted, Army policy rewrites proposed in record time. But inside her office, Lieutenant General Rebecca Hale sat quietly, reading a single page. Her orders. Effective August 1st, she would be reassigned to the Pentagon as Deputy Director for Institutional Reform, United States Army. She folded the paper and stared out the window. The trees beyond the parade field swayed gently in the summer breeze. She could hear the rhythmic cadence of a drill instructor in the distance, firm but no longer angry. Raines entered without knocking. "So," she said, "it's official?" Hale nodded. "Yeah." "You going to say no?" "I don't want to," Hale admitted, "but maybe I have to." "You made this place stand again," Raines said. "Maybe now it's time to help others do the same." That afternoon, Hale walked the base one last time. She visited every building, every checkpoint. She shook hands, embraced soldiers, made quiet promises to return. In the motor pool, Rivera handed her a small envelope. "It's not much," she said, "but we wanted you to have something from us." Inside was a simple patch, hand-stitched, a single mountain silhouette. Underneath it, Delaney rises. Hale didn't speak. She simply placed a hand on Rivera's shoulder, then nodded. At sunset, the entire base assembled in formation, not by order, but by choice. Hale stepped up to a small platform, hands behind her back. "I came here to command," she said, "but I stayed because I was commanded. By you, by your courage, your honesty, your refusal to accept what was easy." She paused. "I didn't fix Fort Delaney, you did. And you'll keep doing it, because this place is no longer built on fear. It's built on each other." Silence. Then from the back, a lone soldier shouted, "Hoo-ah!" It echoed, once, twice, then hundreds of voices, layered with pride and reverence. "Hoo-ah!" Hale saluted, and they saluted back. As the crowd dispersed, Hale stood with Rains one last time. "You stayin'?" Hale asked. "Someone's got to make sure the next commander understands what they're inheriting." They clasped hands, like warriors and friends. That night, Hale packed light. No medals, no plaques. Just the patch from Rivera, a photo of her team, and the hand-scribbled page Richter had once left behind. "We are what we protect." At dawn, her helicopter lifted over the parade field. She didn't look down. She didn't need to. Fort Delaney was ready to rise on its own. Washington was different. Polished marble replaced concrete. Strategic briefings replaced morning drills. And every conversation seemed to begin with protocol and end with hesitation. Lieutenant General Rebecca Hale, newly appointed Deputy Director for Institutional Reform, stepped into the Pentagon with her boots still worn from Delaney. Her uniform was crisp, but her posture carried the quiet weight of lived leadership. Inside her new office, larger, colder, full of untouched furniture, she unpacked 3 items: a framed photo of Fort Delaney's Mercer Center, the hand-stitched patch, "Delaney rises," and a handwritten quote pinned to her wall: "Power means nothing if it forgets who it serves." Within days, meetings flooded her schedule. Senators, undersecretaries, think tanks, all eager to shape the Delaney Doctrine, as the press now called it. But Hale wasn't there for doctrine. She was there for change. She met with commanders from across the country, listened to whistleblowers who had once been ignored, and walked the halls of commands that still reeked of old privilege. At one reform summit, a senior general leaned across the table. "You made a lot of enemies cleaning up that base," he said. "What makes you think the system wants to be clean?" Hale met his eyes. "I don't care what the system wants. I care what the soldiers deserve." The room fell silent. She pushed forward 3 draft reforms: independent ethics officers at all brigade-level commands, mandatory leadership immersion for all senior officers in frontline units, protected whistleblower channels linked outside the chain of command. It was met with resistance, slow-walked memos, legal challenges, but Hale expected it. She worked late, spoke directly, and bypassed anyone who dealt in delay. Meanwhile, messages trickled in from Fort Delaney. Rivera had been promoted to sergeant. Rains was mentoring the new commander. The Mercer Center was training visiting NCOs from other posts. And in one letter from a private Hale had never met, "We tell recruits now, this isn't Royston's army anymore. This is ours. Thank you for that." One night, Hale stood alone in the Pentagon courtyard, the Capitol faint in the distance. She lit no cigar, made no speech, called no press. She simply whispered, "I'll make them remember who this uniform belongs to." Above her, the stars were distant, but she had learned at Fort Delaney that the brightest things never came from above. They rose from below, and they didn't ask permission. Autumn in Washington arrived like a hush after thunder. 4 months into her post at the Pentagon, Lieutenant General Rebecca Hale stood before Congress, not for reprimand, but testimony. The room was crowded, military brass, civilian oversight, media leaning forward with pens half raised. The chairwoman of the committee leaned into the mic. "General Hale, what would you say was the moment things began to change at Fort Delaney?" Hale didn't look at her notes. "When someone disappeared," she said plainly, "and no one said wait. When silence was the norm, not the warning sign. That's when I knew the culture wasn't broken. It had been abandoned." There was silence then. "And how did you fix it?" Hale looked up. "I didn't," she said. "They did. The soldiers. The ones who risked everything to tell the truth. My job was to stop standing in their way." Later, walking down the long corridor of Defense Headquarters, she paused outside a glass display case filled with medals, historic documents, and photos of past commanders. One slot had been left empty. She took a folded piece of paper from her pocket, something Richter had once scribbled in the final weeks at Fort Delaney. "A soldier's purpose is not obedience. It's guardianship." She slid the page quietly into the empty frame. At the Mercer Center, now a model for ethics hubs across all major bases, Rivera gave her first speech as staff sergeant. She quoted Hale, then added something of her own. "We're not just part of the Army. We are its conscience. If we forget that, we lose the war before we ever fight it." Back in Washington, Hale stood on the rooftop of the Pentagon as dusk fell over the city. Rains called from Delaney just to say, "The line's still strong." Hale smiled. "Tell them I said thank you." As the stars emerged overhead, she whispered a line to herself. Guardianship. She didn't need a monument. She didn't want one. Fort Delaney had risen, and so had the ones who mattered. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share the video.